to welcome you all here today as well to our Strengthening Sector Resilience workshop. We're really excited that you could all come today, and we're excited to talk to you a bit about some of the opportunities, as well as, I guess, some of the transitional questions around information linkages and capacity building component of the NDIS. Now, just a quick bit of housekeeping from me. So there is some tea, coffee, water and juice. Sorry, there's water on your tables, tea, coffee and juice down the back of the room. Please feel free to help yourself at any time during the proceedings. We will have a short break later in the morning. If you require the facilities, there are toilets at the back of the building. If you just head down the corridor as far as you can go and then turn left, you will find gentlemen's toilets upstairs and ladies' toilets downstairs. If you require an accessible toilet, there is one in the foyer. If you go out through the glass doors you came in the building and turn right, there's one at the end of the corridor. If we do require at any point to evacuate the building in the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the instructions of VCOSS staff. They will guide you out of the building. Your nearest fire escape is through the glass doors you came in, left down the corridor, and at the end of the corridor there is an emergency exit. But that is all from me. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Llewellyn Rangers. I'm the Policy Manager here at VCOSS and have been working with Maeve on a range of projects around disability advocacy and disability information services in the ILC over the last year. But we are very pleased to have Catherine McAlpine with us today. Catherine is a very experienced facilitator and has been around disability advocacy and disability information services for much of her career. So we're very excited to have her with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to her to introduce the session.
Thank you, Llewellyn. Thank you very much, Llewellyn. I thought it might be, so yes, as I said, as Llewellyn said, my name's Catherine McAlpine. I'm been working in advocacy for probably 12-ish years now. Came into the sector as the Executive Officer of Down Syndrome Victoria when my son with Down syndrome was about 5, and was never so pleased to have a career change in my life. So I've worked for state-based organisations and national organisations. So I've worked in the Down syndrome sector for Down Syndrome Australia, and I was the inaugural CEO of Down Syndrome Victoria. Then I was the inaugural CEO of Down Syndrome Australia. And since then I've worked more in systemic advocacy with AFTO and with Valid. And at the moment I'm running my own consultancy, which is Lightside Group, and actually doing quite a lot of work with Dana. So some of the information I'm going to tell you today is actually information that's come through Dana, and I'd certainly recommend that you talk to Mary if you ever want some good information on this. To start with, I was just wondering if we could just quickly do a roll call so that we know who's in the room and on the line.
Hello, Anne Hegarty from Star. Cynthia Pui from Star Victoria. Carolyn Fimpani from Star Victoria.
I'm Jake Lewis. I work for Thornton Harbour Health, formerly Victorian AIDS Council, and also Valid.
Simone Powers, Cerebral Palsy Support Network.
Anya Shiratska, I'm from Huntington's, Victoria.
Natasha from Daru.
Jason from Daru.
Maeve.Kennedy from VCOSS.
Nadia from Women with Disabilities Victoria.
Helen from Women with Disabilities Victoria.
Loretta Walsh from Deaf Children Australia.
Greg from Communication Rights.
Felicia from Cystic Fibrosis Community Care.
Jan Matro from Melbourne East Disability Advocacy.
Fake Demia from Better Hearing Australia.
from Self Advocacy Resource Unit.
Kerry Cassidy from the Disability Resources Centre.
Peter Shakes from AUSDAC, which is Australian Disorders of the Corpus Callosum.
Martin Butcher from Regional Disability Advocacy Service.
And we've just had one late arrival.
Sorry for being late. Adrian Terranova, Gippsland Disability Advocacy.
Thanks, Adrian.
Maeve, did you want to, should we ask the people on the live stream to say hi as well, or is that a bit difficult? Lovely. So there's about 10 people watching on the live stream as well. Really we thought that we'd run today in 3 parts, that we'd start with a couple of hopefully not very long presentations talking about the ILC program in general, and then talking about this particular round, and also giving you a bit of a case study of ILC success, which is from the Regional Disability Advocacy Service, and then I thought when you registered for this workshop, you said what things that you wanted to talk about here and what things you wanted to learn. So hopefully a number of things that you wanted to ask will have already been answered by that point, but then I thought I'd actually revisit the questions, because there are some quite specific questions that just need an answer, rather than not talked about in a more general sense. So we'll go back through the questions and make sure the questions that you asked at the beginning were answered. Probably it'll be at that point that we'll have a break at the end of those questions. And then I thought we'd divide up a bit more into a workshop, and then we'll talk about an application strategy for this round, and talk more specifically about the questions in this round and what might be an approach to the questions in this round. And then certainly when we are at the questions, I'm going to try and deal with the questions that have already been asked, but of course very happy to take questions from the floor at that point. So to start off, is that okay with everyone? Was there anything there that you felt like you missed in terms of what you were hoping to get out of today? So just to talk really more about the ILC in general. So I'm assuming now that you've all been, we've all been in the sector a while, or NDIS has been running out for a while, we've got our heads a little bit around ILC, but of course it really hasn't come, the only organisations in Victoria who really have done any ILC work are ones that were successful in the national grant rounds, because we haven't had a state-specific grant round. So just understanding that this project, and I also did some work actually for NCOSS, for New South Wales Council of Social Services, which is where Martin and I did some work together. Same thing, trying to get organisations that were funded through information advocacy ready for the ILC. And some of the things that we learnt through that process in terms of where some of the real challenges are in ILC. So the first thing is understanding that you understand around the bilateral agreement. So you understand that what's happened is that every state and territory has agreed that instead of funding organisations directly in the information space, in particular, in information linkages and capacity building, that information will now go into the NDIS pool, and then the NDIA will then fund organisations. And that was intended to be a bit of a reset of the state and territory based information funding. One of the things that was true and is true is duplication. So there's a lot of duplication in the state and territory funding, because if I look at where I came from in the Down syndrome sector, what I can actually say to you, I know for a fact that a whole lot of the state and territory organisations were all busy doing information on what is Down syndrome, information for new parents, information on education, information on employment, and a lot of that was consistent, but was the same, and it was a wasted effort, because organisations are getting a tiny bit of funding, but in actual fact, then what they do with it is duplication. And so one of the things that we really need to understand from the ILC is there's an intent to reduce duplication, and that is something for us to think about when we make our applications. Another thing is that in the, and some of you in the room I think are not going to be thrilled to hear this bit, but the information, you know, a lot of organisations that were funded as information providers are service providers. And some information providers are very much user-led organisations. And I have to say, there's a definite push and there's a definite desire from the NDIS for more user-led. And this grant round is an example of that, and we can talk about that as we go on today. But there's certainly a bigger emphasis on a user-led organisation in terms of where information comes from. The other thing is that it's now that we've moved to a market environment, so now we're in a competitive market, the value of independent information has always gone up. So what really has got me is I've now spent the last couple of years going around running workshops and talking to organisations about getting ready for the NDIS, and particularly information advocacy organisation. That's where they're the organisations I really want to see be successful. Well, we need good for service providers as well, but I think that the information advocacy organisations are the most vulnerable organisations in terms of managing the change to the NDIS. And just lost my train of thought. Lost my train of thought on that one. Sorry, because I was talking about the reset, the emphasis on user-led. So what we've found, or what the agency has found since doing the ILC rounds that they've done so far, is they're not really achieving what they wanted to achieve. They're actually, because they've gone, you know, they use this DSS system. So what happens is you put your application in, it goes through an initial screening by the DSS crew. So not anyone at the agency, not anyone who really is on top of the content in terms of an expert in what we are all expert in. And so what happens is organisations are getting knocked out at that screening round before they even get to the good content that's in their that they've got. And it's because you know, information specific or disability specific or advocacy organisations are making mistakes or not addressing some of the really core issues that you have to tick off before you even can get through to the people from the agency who are then going to evaluate your application. And so what's happened is that a lot of user-led organisations have not been successful. A lot of advocacy organisations have not been successful so far. More service providers have been successful, and that's not the intent of the ILC. Is they really want to see that the user-led organisations are the ones that really lead. That was what I was going to say about the independent information. So I've worked for organisations. I spent the first 8 years of my time in this sector working for really information support organisations, disability-specific organisations. I worked for 8 years, and we talked about the importance of evidence, and we talked about the importance of the lived experience, and we went on and on and on about it. Never once did I say to the members, the important thing is that we're independent. Because once you're in a market environment, you have to get information that's independent somewhere. So it's that thing about, if you're trying to buy a TV and you walk into the Sony shop, they really are going to try their best to sell you the Sony that meets your needs. It's going to be great. Or you walk into the Apple shop, and they're going to really try and sell you the Apple that meets your needs. But you need Choice magazine to tell you which things are going to be, you know, an independent thing to go, well, Sony's not so good on this, they're better on this and worse on that, and Apple's better on this and worse on that. And that's where the information, the independent information that comes from information organisations and advocacy organisations has become more important, because NDIS participants don't always understand that some of the information they've been given is actually marketing in nature. It feels like people are helping, but maybe there's a conflict of interest that's not being addressed. No, I mean independent of... sorry, yes. The question is, could I just explain what I mean by independent? Am I talking about structure, or what am I talking about? What I mean really is independent of service provision. So if you are saying if someone's saying, you know, what support, you know, this is the condition I've got, what should I do next? Getting the information from a service provider, there's an inherent conflict of interest because the service provider is trying to sell you the thing. And it doesn't mean that the service, so again, when you go to the Sony shop, it's really good to be told, well, this is how it's going to help, this is how it's going to meet your needs. There's a whole lot of detail that a service provider will give you that's very helpful. And so in no way is this saying, no, you shouldn't go and get your information from your service providers, but there might be another, you know, another thing. So, you know, there's issues, you know, there's issues in the deaf sector about the fact that parents are told all these things about interventions and not said these are maybe some of the long-term implications that you might want to think about before you make some of these irreversible decisions about whether or not you have an implant. Or there might be so that's about what sort of therapies you might have. It might be that a provider that you've been going, you know, there's evidence, more and more evidence that says if you get all your services from one provider, not so great for choice and control, maybe not so, you know, maybe you're living quite segregated life, you know, what does that mean? So maybe having someone from a disability-specific organisation say, you know what, there's this sort of things. If you get them from a traditional service provider, they're really good at that. But maybe you also want to try something new. Try this, try that, try the other in a mainstream environment, which means getting something, you know. So it's that independent information that gives you suggestions on a different way of going about things. That the disability-specific organisations and advocacy organisations are not trying to sell you something at the same time. So it's you know, there's lack of what you're trying to do is give information without conflict of interest. Yeah, there's a microphone floating around. Just wait for the microphone, otherwise the live stream people can't hear you.
So in instance, if that service provider is also information provider for a very specific, very small community, and you cannot expect that there will be another specialist organization.
Well, then that's the thing where the thing that's most problematic is when the conflict of interest is not recognised.
Okay.
So it doesn't mean you can't give information, and it doesn't mean that some of the information you give isn't independent. But if you are effectively giving people information and at the same time directing them towards a service, then you need to name it that that's a conflict of interest and say to them, talk to, you know, and what the thing that you do there is say, talk to other people, talk to other peers, talk to other people, and find out if that's the right solution for you. So if you really do have a conflict of interest, then naming it would be part of the process. But in terms of just going back to the ILC, what the agency, so when I say the agency, I'm talking about the National Disability Insurance Agency, what they've found is that they're not meeting all their needs. Some of the things that they wanted to see come out of the ILC grants are not necessarily happening. They've noticed that a lot of organisations that they want to be successful have not been successful. And so therefore they're developing this new ILC investment strategy. So we're still waiting. You might remember that there was the ILC, I've forgotten the name of the document now, the ILC policy document that came out before you know, about 3 years ago now, that told us, you know, these were the investment priorities and these were the outcomes that we are looking to see. So they had that document. They're now looking to put out this new ILC strategy. And so what's happened is this particular round is a non-competitive round, and it's basically trying to fix that gap. It's trying to put in some resources for the organisations who have not been, the types of organisations who have not been successful so far, to try and build their capacity to be successful from now on. So this is a bit of a different round. And so that's why we need to talk about, I don't want to spend too long on the big ILC picture, but there's going to be another grant round probably in February or March next year, and that will go back probably to being competitive round. And so what you want to think about that longer term competitive round and how you can use this short term non-competitive round to build your capacity to be successful in the future. So that's why we need to relate them to each other. So just talking about ILC in general, in terms of Martin.
What do you think I mean by competitive and non-competitive round? Because I talk about it in regard to non-competitive, but everybody in the room is only a certain pool of money. So
Yes, so the competitive, of course, the competitive round says that what happens is all these organisations put in their ideas, and then they will look at what they're aiming to achieve with the ILC guidelines, and then they will pick the projects that best fit those guidelines, and a whole lot of good ideas will miss out, because if you have the same idea as someone else and you're a smaller organisation and they're, maybe you have a great idea, but you say you're only going to do it in a small geographical area, and someone else put in a very similar idea and they're going to do it in a bigger geographical area, then probably the bigger one's going to get up and you're going to miss out. Or maybe you've got a great idea, and this is, I can give you an example. When that peer, remember when what turned out to be Peer Connect, you remember that was the first one, probably a lot of you were involved in before the ILC came out. And I was working for Down Syndrome Australia at the time, and I convinced all the state and territories to talk to each other and show each other what they were writing. And one of the states wrote about, so this was about peer support, right? So we were supposed to write all this stuff about peer support, and they put in about putting information into mainstream services and all this other stuff. And we gave them the feedback. You haven't addressed the guidelines, and you're not going to, this is competitive. If you don't address the guidelines, the ones that do address the guidelines are the ones that are going to get in. And they went, no, but it's the object of the scheme. Well, it doesn't matter what the object of the scheme is. You've got to write to the grant guidelines. They put in what they put in, and they were unsuccessful. And so you might remember the outrage at the time. There were a lot of organisations that put in good ideas and weren't successful because the agency could only fund this amount of stuff, and they decided what the priorities were. This one, when you talk about our understanding is that the agency has done some work about how many organisations they think will meet the criteria. So this time they're talking about the DPFOs, so the Disabled People and Family Organisations, and they have already done a bit of a stock take Australia-wide as to how many organisations they think will actually meet that criteria. And our understanding is they think it's between about 150 and 200 organisations. Can we use we'll just get you to use the microphone.
So what about the priority cohort organisations?
So the priority organisations are well, that's actually, if I could come back to that slightly later, because I'll just talk about ILC in general, and then we'll talk specifically about this round. So the biggest thing, and it was interesting because I sat down with Martin, and it was the first thing out of his mouth as well, is write to the guidelines, which is the same as that story that I just told, is that if you don't write to the guidelines, and if you don't meet the key criteria, which we will get to, you will get tossed out in the first round. So you'll get tossed out by DSS. Like the DSS grants people take the first look. You'll be out the door before it even gets to the NDIA team who are going to assess it on content. Listen to the people. My next tip is listen to the people. This still goes to write the guidelines. Listen to the people who have been successful. So I have found it quite frustrating that I have run workshops, I'm trying to help organisations, and they keep going, but this is a really good idea. And it's like, yes, but it doesn't meet the guidelines. So the same as this Down Syndrome Association that wouldn't listen when we said, you haven't written to the guidelines, we don't think you're going to be successful. I've had organisation after organisation after organisation say, no, but we're going to do this. And they keep not being successful, and then they're really cross. But I would say to you, I have noticed a lot of organisations not listening, not writing to guidelines, and not listening to the feedback that what they're writing isn't consistent with the guidelines. And so that would be my number one. You need to be able to demonstrate the meaningful involvement of people with disabilities. So when I talk to the people who have been successful already, one of the things that they say is key is the meaningful involvement of people with disability in the governance of the project as well as as beneficiaries of the project. Meaningful involvement of people with disabilities. Not all good ideas are within the guidelines. So you probably, if you've been working in the sector for a while, you're probably bursting with really good ideas. All of those ideas are probably great. Not all of those ideas will meet the guidelines. You've got to pick the idea that meets the guidelines. In this particular round, I will go back, but in most of the rounds, they give some examples of the sorts of things they're looking to fund. And in this one in particular, they've given you a list of examples. you need to have a really good reason to not be offering up a suggestion that's not in that list. You really, really, really want to look at that list and how you can make whatever it is that you're thinking about doing, is making sure it's on that list. Number two would be collaboration. If you look at the organisations that have been successful so far, collaboration has really come into it. So it means that you get the opportunity to share. It means things like sharing ideas between local and national networks. If you're a state-based disability-specific organisation, do you have a national network? If you're a locally based advocacy organisation, what about the other people in your region? What about other people? How are you going to be able to share the information? How are you going to be able to reduce duplication? So I talked about the Down Syndrome associations and how they duplicate stuff, but it happens in advocacy as well, because people are often writing, they're often talking about how to access advocacy, or, you're often writing about similar things. And so one of the things you want to think about is how that works. Sorry, I just didn't go back to the non-competitive, what Martin said about non-competitive. So I told you that they think that they know that there's about 150, 200 organisations. They're trying to say everyone will get funded this time round. If you meet the criteria, then you'll get funded. Now, not everyone will get funded to the $118,000. And there's some caveats in there which I'll point to when we talk about the grant round. But it means that because of the nature of the thing they're talking about peer support groups, they're talking about capacity building of your organisation. It means that if you think that the thing you need most this time round is some board training, you're not going to miss out because 3 other organisations have also gone in and said, we need board training, because in this case, we need all 4 boards or all 10 boards or all 30 boards to have the training, because that's what you've identified as the thing that's needed. So this time your ideas are not competitive. Your ideas are just, do you meet the guidelines? Do you meet the criteria in terms of being an eligible organisation? So we'll talk about that. And then do you meet the guide, and then have you written a project that meets the guidelines? And if you do both of those, you should get funding this time round, which is not how it's been and unlikely to be how it will be. But right now, this thing, if you'd meet all those things, you should get money. So that's the difference between a non-competitive round. The other thing about collaboration is that it can help you show value for money. And you'll notice that value for money is one of the things that gets mentioned in the guidelines quite a lot. The third thing is data, is having some evidence. And I'm about to give you some tips in terms of the things you can do now. And one of the things that almost the most important thing you can do is start to collect data in advance of your grant round. So you're not going to need quite so much data for this grant round, but you're going to need data for the next grant round. And when I say data, the first thing you want to do is get evidence of need. And the simplest way to do that is just with a membership survey. If you're a membership-based organisation, ask your members what they want from you. Ask what they're missing, where the gaps are, what are the gaps in there, and particularly we're talking about information linkages and capacity building. Where are the gaps in their information? Where are the gaps in their linkages? Where are the gaps in their capacity building? Now, you might not use those words, because saying to people, saying to people with disability and families, oh, what capacity building do you want? So you need to ask other questions, but they're the things you can do. And so one very successful organisation has been successful in nearly every grant round. What they did is they did a really detailed membership survey right at the beginning of our ILC, and they said we've used it for every application since. So you won't be able to live off the one survey forever. And maybe when you do your first survey, maybe you find out as you go along that you didn't ask maybe all the right questions, or maybe you could do some other information. But talk to your members and get evidence of need. And evidence of need would also include things like a lot of the advocacy organisations have got waiting lists. That's another type of evidence of need. Depends a little bit on how that relates to your idea. But as much evidence. And the other data is thinking about, and this goes back to collaboration, is don't talk about the 10 people who are going to benefit. Talk about the 10 people who are going to benefit, how the project is going to be a model it's a pilot for stuff that the next time you do it, 20 people are going to benefit. You're going to share it with your neighbouring organisation or with your national organisation, so all of them are going to benefit. Or you're developed a resource that's going to be on the website. It's going to be applicable to us and to all these other people. So you really want to look at the leverage of your collaboration and your networks. And if you've got any data on any of that, then that's helpful. But you don't ever want to talk about just the one person or the two people or the 10 people. You want to talk about how that, you know, amplification is one of the, well, I'm getting to spin now. And sometimes there are words that help. Amplification is a word of the decade. Let's talk about amplification. One organisation explained to me how they put in an application for a website that was unsuccessful. So on the next grant round, they put in an application for an information portal, and that was successful. So sometimes, unfortunately, there are some words that work better than others. So the last thing I wanted to do in this stage before so what we're going to do is, I've talked about ILC in general. Martin's going to talk to you about his success in a previous ILC round. Then we're going to get onto this round in particular. But the things that I would talk about that you can do now. So the things that you can do now are, have you actually done the thinking at a board level, at an EO level? What's the activities that you would like to do in ILC? Instead of waiting until the grant round comes, think about what are the sorts of things that you might like to do? Where are the improvements in the information you provide? Where are the improvements in the linkages? Where are the improvements in the capacity building that you would like to do? Because you're experienced in what you do, you'll know a lot of that stuff already, but actually start to think about the solutions. One of the things in advocacy, and again, when I read people's applications, can spend a lot of time admiring the problem. What solutions are you offering? So that's number one. Number two, data collection. Oh, sorry, these are the 4 headings I should get in. So in terms of the ILC activity, what will you do? When I've talked about this previously, I've said, how does it align with the objectives of the ILC policy? They're going to put out this new investment strategy. You're going to need to have a look at the investment strategy and see whether your idea aligns with the investment strategy. Does it align with the ILC outcomes? Are the outcomes of your project aligned with the ILC outcomes, the sorts of things they want to see? When I say they, I'm talking about the NDIA. And the other thing that hasn't been mentioned a lot, but is in the standard ILC stuff, is does it complement the LAC role? So local area coordinators, the ILC is intended to complement that. They're not expecting that local area coordinators know everything. For instance, they're not expecting them to know everything about every thing about advocacy or everything about a particular disability, but they need to know where to go. Sure. I'm just stepping aside so people can read those 4 things. Oh, sorry, I should have said, Maeve is happy to, sorry, I'm standing aside and saying, we can email you this. So, sorry, I didn't give this to Maeve early enough for her to email it to you in advance, but she can email it to you afterwards. So the things that are actually written on the slides, you'll get, but if there's any other information, you might want to write that down. Got my sizes wrong there. The bit that I'm saying doing now, any outcomes of work you already do, you might want to start asking people about that. What are the outcomes of what you already do? And some of that might be about whether people feel more independent, able to be more independent. So you need to ask the people that you support now. When I say map member needs, that's the thing about saying to people, what are your needs from our organisation? And there are 2 things you want to look for. The things that we already do well, don't just ask them about unmet need, ask them about what do you get from us that you value, because sometimes that might be what you need to ask for an ILC, is actually the stuff you're doing well, making sure you continue that on. So you might already have evidence that that's working well. You're about to lose your state funding, but the agency should keep doing that because we already know that we meet that member need well. Then there's unmet need. Then you say to your members, what else do you want from us that we're not providing at the moment? And when I say measure social capital, that's doing things like volunteer hours. You know, I remember when I was at Down Syndrome Victoria and we were like, oh, how do we do that? And it's like, well, got this many board members. They meet this often. We've got this many people come to this family day that we run, got this many people. And the next thing we knew, and then we just multiplied it out at about $25 an hour. Like you just choose a basic, not even a very expensive hourly rate. And the next thing we knew, we already were getting sort of $150,000 worth of volunteer hours. And that's just the back of an envelope thing. But that's enough. As long as you put what your assumptions are, you're fine. What about your local networks? What's the value of your local networks? What's the value of your relationship with the library or with a neighbourhood house or with some other local thing? Like, it's worth trying to, if you can't put numbers on it, at least be able to put a narrative around it. One of the things we're not good at doing is understanding our costs. Because we are experts at robbing people to pay Paul, we are experts at going, we're doing this bit of work that has a bit of a, surplus. We do this bit of work that we really care about, but it makes a dead loss. It's understanding, like starting to divide that up, understanding which bits of your work are financial, which bits aren't, which things what are your overheads, what are your fixed costs as opposed to the project-related costs. Really understanding that in a way that we haven't always before. We've got a bad habit of doing a global budget and not necessarily project budgets. So starting to understand that, and if you don't understand that, then working out a strategy so that you can get better at it. Thinking about value for money. The other thing is thinking about organisational capacity. So one of the things that you need to demonstrate at ILC is that you have the capacity to deliver. So I had one organisation who had who their regular income for the last few years had been around the $150,000, $160,000. So that was their regular turnover. That was the size of the organisation. They put in for a $3 million project. And again, didn't want to listen when it's like it's a really bad idea to put in for a $3 million project when you're a $150,000 organisation. You've got to put you've got to be able to show that you can run a project like that. But then I would say to you, my experience at AFTO was, we put in for a, $150,000 one, and then we put in for another, and by the time I left, we were into the $1.5 million type of projects. So you can build, but you can't get there in one step. You've got to do it more slowly, and they've got to know that you've got project management capability as well as expertise in what you're going to do, because they're two different things. And the last thing is, do you have grant writing capacity or access to grant writing capacity? So you're all here, possibly you're all the people that are doing the grant writing, so that's great if your organisation's got that. If you don't, have a think about where you're going to get it, and think about that before the grant round so that you can have someone lined up. So you might just have someone that you pay an hourly rate to that just helps you with your grant submissions, and then you go on with your daily, you don't need to put someone on staff. Or you might have a staff member that's good at it, but it is expertise worth looking for, if you can. And then the last thing is to think about efficiency, to think about how you're going to reduce duplication, think about your potential partners, think about your potential competitors. They're often the same organisations. Maybe the people that you think about competitors could become partners, particularly in the particularly in the competitive grant rounds. That's much less important this time, but it is going to be more important ongoing. Think about how your project is going to provide value to the agency. And that's why you need to talk about the number of people that are going to benefit, because they don't want to spend $150,000 on one person. I've rearranged it so that I'm not going to talk about the tips for this round now. We're going to talk about the success of the RDAS application. So Regional Disability Advocacy Service works in New South Wales and Victoria, and so therefore we're part of the New South Wales jurisdictional round and had some success there. And so Martin's just going to show you some of the things, talk to you a bit about the success that they had and what his learnings are and how that might help you.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, as Catherine mentioned, I'm Martin Butcher from Regional Disability Advocacy Service. We are based in Wodonga and we cover North East Victoria and Southern Power New South Wales. If you know, Southern Power New South Wales is almost a big Victoria itself because we go virtually from the ACT border to the South Australian border. So that through you may have known me from DAIS, we were Disability Advocacy and Information Service. I emphasize information for a very important reason because advocacy, when you talk about ILC, advocacy is not a proper word. When you talk about information, we are. So, how we, and often by providing people with information, you are actually advocating with them. So, well, we'll go on. So, within New South Wales, we were putting our grant, we got $500,000 over 2 years. So when you think about capacity building, value for money isn't doing things on the cheap. Value for money is, will the ILC achieve an outcome from investing? We can't emphasize enough. Sit down with your highlight pens, preferably one being funded by your ILC grant in the past. Although the guidelines do say the time you spend applying for your grant can't be included in your application, but I open this. Sorry, I'm back in my studio. So, sit down with a cup of coffee and a highlighter pen and go through the application and highlight. Sorry, I only brought half my cup. Anyway, highlight the application. Highlight what keywords. Highlight the outcome. And you will see that on there, they got a very clear outcome, where it's about information that will achieve the right of people's rights. Very clear. So, think about what they want. When I actually looked at the application, download the application form. You do it online, but having it in hard copy first helps. The other thing I've seen, a big application, the actual important bit that I got to read is 550 words. What are you going to achieve? All of it is your name, your contact details, your budget. But in doing that, what is your outcome? And we might talk about later about outcomes. What is your output? How are you going to achieve? And for example, the project we worked on was, our data we knew was Aboriginal people from coal backgrounds, and people living in rural and remote areas were ability to access the NDIS and other services than other people with disabilities. Gap. How are we going to fill that gap? Being located in a rural area is a first help that we're looking at doing. And our motto is independent, local and free. So we are saying our region might sound big, but our specialty is we will try and be local. So the activity we see, we are going to identify 20 communities. Now it could be an Aboriginal community, it could be in Albury, a population of 100,000. But within that, there might be a cold community that are not accessing the NDIS. So we're going to target very small, and then rural and remote towns with a population of less than 5,000 people. We are going to go into those communities and talk to them about what event we could organise with them and organise an event in the town, a community-wide event. And I keep emphasising to my staff, the people we don't want at these events are people with disabilities. In a way, we want it to be a community-wide event so that people in the community who don't understand the NDIS, who don't know how to access the service, will be there so that we can give information to them. Of course, people with disabilities will come, but that's not our target group. So in that round, the guidelines were very specific. They wanted the main target group were, as I said, Aboriginal, cold, and people in rural and remote. So I picked that up and wrote my proposal around that. You will see through ILC, you will read through the ILC that they will not fund advocacy. What they don't say is we will not fund advocacy organisations. They will fund information, they will fund community development. So our project is very much a community development. One bit, so look at so going back to what I was talking about in your 500 words, sorry, 525 words to be precise, no more. You will need to look at what is your outcome, what is your output. So what we are saying is we will provide community-wide event for 20 communities. We will talk to 1,000 people. From that 1,000 people, we hope to identify 30 people who are people with disabilities or older people who are not receiving services, who will work for 3 months to give them the information and support they need to be able to link into their services. So we were quite clear. We know what we are going to, our output will be. They are very clear about what their output will be. The thing about it is keep it simple made a mistake in the past. I was saying, let's put into the application everything we think we can do. Then we get the job on and say, deliver it. Or, hang on, they fund it in at the end of May, for the beginning of June, beginning of July. So therefore you got to recruit, you got to get down on board. You've already lost 2 months, so you only got 11 months. So don't try and do too much in your 12 months. The other tip I would say is so I've got to get my cheat note. Don't try and replace what you're already doing. If you're doing something in your organization, you think, I'm trying to make the guidelines fit what I want to do, that won't work. What you got to do is, how are you going to use your expertise and skills to do what you, how are you going to do what your expertise to do what the guidelines are doing? I'm happy to, I've only talked about what I've done. I'm happy to do later on, talk about what I think, looking at the guidelines, what I can do. Any questions?
Don't forget your highlighters. Okay. So that's talking about the ILC more generally, and the reason that it was worth talking about those things is there are two main reasons. One, a lot of that is still relevant in these guidelines, in this round, the biggest difference being the non-competitive. And secondly, it's thinking about that bigger ILC rounds and how you can use this round to get ready for that, because this is very much the purpose of this round, is to get you ready for that. So, again, we go now to the tips for this round. And the first thing I would say is write to the guidelines. So, this is where, is everyone, I wasn't going to talk in any detail until we get to questions about what a DPFO is. Do you need me to talk about that at this point? I think you probably know whether you meet the definition of a DPFO or not. So disabled. Do you want to go through that? So, so the first thing is that, so I assume that you're familiar with the term DPO, Disabled Persons Organisation. So a Disabled Person Organisation is a definition by the UN as part of the convention, really, saying that these are organisations run for and by people with disability. And it's defined specifically as more than 50% of people with disability as your members and more than 50% of people with disability in your governance on your board. And that's been very clear for a long time. But there's been quite a lot of advocacy at the UN as well, not just locally, to say that works well for people with disability who have enough capacity to do all the self-advocacy. It's not so great for some other disabilities, particularly intellectual disability, where you have the involvement of families and you have the involvement of other people. And as soon as you put families into the mix, and I come, as you know, from the Down syndrome background. You have members, you know, got two parents and 2.1 kids or 3.1 kids. The people with disability are already only a quarter of your population. If you're an organisation that works with children, you've got families as members. And if you're an advocacy organisation, it's a slightly different structure, but it doesn't work. So that's why you've got the family. So this round is specifically saying if you've got 50% of people with disability or family members, one or the other or a mix of both as your members, and 50% of people with disability or families on your board, then you meet the criteria. Unless you're a cohort-based organisation, in which case you have to reach the same thresholds in your cohort. So if you're a called organisation or whatever. Now, there is, I must say that Dana is doing a little bit of advocacy on this point, in that there are organisations around that I think would meet the spirit of this funding round who don't meet those criteria. And it would have been lovely if there'd been room for them to build their capacity to be there. But one of the things I think is really, really important in this round is to demonstrate the meaningful involvement of people with disabilities. And one of the things you might want to be looking at doing is really strengthening that. So one of the things, and I think it comes up almost in the first suggestion of the sorts of things they might fund, is increasing the involvement of people with disabilities in your organisation. And so even for the family organisation, so if you're an organisation, so one of the things, for instance, Down Syndrome Australia has been very successful in the ILC grants so far, and one of the things they've done in the last 3 years is they've got their Down Syndrome Advisory Network up, which is the advisory group made up of people with Down syndrome, and really making sure that, yes, they always met the family criteria, but where's the voice of people with Down syndrome? So for you to be looking at your governance and looking at your structures and saying, how can you strengthen the role of people with disabilities in that, would be one of the key activities that they would be keen to see in this. I'll just get you a microphone.
Can I just ask a question about membership? And I'm assuming that that's actually, whether it be paid or unpaid membership, as opposed to the folk who you're serving as clients or consumers.
I think when you say servicing, if you're talking about advocacy, yes. Right, so if you're talking about advocacy, I think, and Martin, maybe you can give me advice on here, but I think you could, I think you absolutely should talk about them, because the people that you're servicing will be people with disability. It's really, you won't be able to do the people that you service provision, if I talk about being a service provider in terms of providing individualised services under the, to NDIS participants that they can pay through their plan, that would be an area of problem, and I don't think you can talk about them. When you're talking about advocacy, I think whether or not you refer to them as members, I think you need to tell the truth if they're not members, but I think you can say, this is the community that we serve, and this is the community that we represent. I think you really can make that case. So some organisations have members and not, like Valid, for example, has members and then has its client base. And so when it talks about these things, it actually does concentrate on members. So certainly Valid and Inclusion Australia have also been successful with ILC, and they have talked to their memberships as much as they've talked to, but they talk about their expertise in servicing a community. So you do both.
Can I ask a
question?
Martin
might have another answer to that, because he is in that space.
I look at, particularly if you are funded under the Commonwealth Disability Advocacy Program, they talk about, and maybe the difficulty is every organisation got a different model, but they say your client base are not particularly members, but they talk about you have members of the association who got a voting right. I guess, have the person got voting right to select your board? If your constitution enable, and go back to your constitution, and how do they define members as opposed to your client group. So you can't, what the index says is you can't discriminate whether people are members or not. So I understand that you might have citizen advocacy type organizations that talk about members, but I think you got to be careful about how much control does that client have in attending the AGM and be able to vote for your board.
Yep, and I do think as long as you've got some membership, so if you're not a membership-based organisation, that might be problematic, but you could build your membership, could be the capacity building thing that you do. As long as you've got a couple of members already. So you could say, we've always concentrated on clients and not on members, but to build our capacity, we need to, yes, have more people with voting rights. And also that will increase the meaningful involvement of people with disabilities in the governance of your organisation at the same time. So, and Martin's already mentioned it, and again, I talk to advocacy organisations that have been successful already in the ILC grant, and they really talked about community development, that that community development is a natural extension of advocacy. It's something that you probably do already, whether or not you name it, you would do it already. And it also that you can, I think, and again, I think when you talk about value for money, you can possibly talk about the reduced need for individual advocacy and the increase, or at least the increased capacity to do more, to self-advocate and to do things by yourself. So your value is actually, if you've got really long waiting lists, then what other activities in terms of community development can you do, or capacity building that you can do that will actually help people do things for themselves and not need as much individual advocacy. I've also made a note of don't wedge a long-term plan or something you already do into guidelines when it doesn't fit. So Martin and I both come in with that, and don't include existing service delivery. Now, when I'm saying service delivery, so not your advocacy service delivery, not any service delivery that can be delivered through people's plans. The one bit where, whether you call it service delivery or not, is information provision. If you're a disability-specific organisation providing information, then that is something you probably will continue to, that will be something that you were funded through the state to do, and now you want to be funded through ILC to do. That probably is an existing thing, but you will need to refresh it. You'll need to talk about the new stuff you're putting out. You won't be able to say, oh, we want to get paid for continuing to roll it out. But again, if I was to use the Down syndrome example, one of the things they do is visit new parents in hospital. So that is the same thing, but it's new people. So the continued capacity to go and visit new parents in hospital is a thing that they need to protect, that you can't pay for out of plans because the baby was just born, that they don't have an NDIS plan yet. So it's a thing that falls in possibly into ILC. And so therefore so this is the bit where you want to get out your highlighter. Martin, there you go. I've highlighted my bits. So section 4.1 is the eligible grant activities. And so if you're a DPFO, then you've got to do two things. You've got to do organisational capacity building and individual capacity building. And I think you will be more successful if you can link the two. So again, for example, the organisational capacity building might be to increase the number of the meaningful involvement of people with disability. Your individual capacity building might be running some sort of course for people with disability so that they can, like a board, how to be on a board or how to run meetings or some other thing that you might want to do. So here, they've given a list. So it says the types of organisational capacity building activities eligible under this grant round could include, and I'm reading from page 19 of the guidelines: upskilling, training or developing existing or potential staff, volunteers or committee board members to improve their leadership skills and capability, e.g. leadership training for staff, board members and or volunteers with disability. So basically, that's their number one thing, upskilling people with disability. Developing and delivering strategies and activities to strengthen the involvement of people with disability and or families in organisational decision making. Again, recruiting staff, volunteers and board members. Developing and delivering strategies and activities to support knowledge and skill transfer between board members with and without disability. How are you doing your succession planning? Is everything dependent on one person? establishing and maintaining partnerships to collaborate with other organisations. So you can see these themes that I've already talked about are there in the guidelines. So you've got about 9 or 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think there's 9 things there. And it includes scoping and developing a business case for revenue generating services that lead towards financial independence. So it might mean scoping out something new for your organisation. So there are a range of things you could do, but these are quite broad, and I would say really strongly, stay within these. Like, don't go and have some left field idea. This is what they're telling you what they want to fund. Oh, I haven't brought more than my copy, but it is the information linkages and capacity building grant opportunity guidelines that when you go onto the community hub, this is one of the things that you download. So you could possibly talk to Maeve, might be able to even, I mean, they're extensive, they're 45 pages, but these are the grant guidelines. These are the things, as Martin said, that you go onto the community hub, you download all the documents, you go take yourself off to a local cafe and you read them with your highlighter. But seriously, that's what we do. You go and sit down and tell everyone to leave you alone for a little while and spend an hour reading them. I think that Maeve might, certainly at the end of, before we hit the workshop part, we'll try and get a few copies because we'll have a little break then. Good idea. Show of hands, who might like a copy of the guidelines to look at today? So that's about 5 or 6, yeah. Oh, yes. Well, you'll notice that I've said that the things that we want to look at are section 4.1, section 4.2, and question 12. So what you're asking me, just so you know, is question 12. So I'm definitely going to address that because I know there are people in the room that want to talk about that. So that first, oh, sorry, yes? No, I was moving on to independent capacity building.
I thought it was individual capacity building. Is that a component too?
Oh, sorry, individual. I just said independent. I meant to say individual.
Good. So we've just completed a LGBTI disability capacity building project at our organisation. I understand that we're only able to apply for individual capacity building activities. Are we able to apply for the full 118 with just that component, or is there a reduction in?
I believe that you can. I believe that you can apply for it all, but I would go back to your organisational capacity and say, how big are you? Again, I don't think you should automatically go. I think most organisations are going to go for the 118, like absolutely. But you also just need to look at how big you are. So just assume that you're a big enough organisation that 118 is not an abnormal size project for you to run.
No.
So therefore, I don't see any reason why not. But I would say that they're going to want to fund the organisations that they fund. I'm going to come back to question 12, which might impact on you as well.
Just in terms of value for money, let's say we do apply for the 118. Do you think that we could get feedback as to saying, okay, 118 is probably a little bit too much, but value for money might be 80,000 or 70,000?
They won't do that. No, they will judge you on what you put in. That there won't be any negotiation on that. The only way they'll do that is if they are oversubscribed and they're asking multiple organisations for a step back, then they'll come and negotiate with you on that. But in terms of the value for money, you have to make your case and you won't have the opportunity to negotiate it back down. Unless you write it in. You can write it in. We could do this amount of work for this much money and then we could do that amount of work. You can almost give them you've only got your 550 words. You could almost give them an either or, but can be risky.
Keep in mind, if you're employing a project type worker or a project implementation, by the time you do your staff, I would member. Now you might break that up into 2 part-time people, but keep in mind that 118 wouldn't be any more than 1 full-time equivalent staff member.
Absolutely. So again, you again on the next page, they've got component 2, the individual capacity building activities, and they've particularly talked about peer support groups, mentoring programs, individual or group based, skill building programs for self-management and independence, capacity building programs to enable people to speak up for themselves, and other programs or activities to develop the capacity of individuals with disability. So they have again told us quite specifically, these are the things we're interested in funding. And again, I would say you'd have to have a really, really left field innovative idea to get something up that's not already in that scope. And so I'd say to you really strongly, stay within that scope. I would just note it again about collaboration. Collaboration's less urgent in this round because they really are saying that they will fund you if you meet everything. If you give an idea within the guidelines and you're a DPFO, and we're assuming that there's no one in the room that doesn't, doesn't promote the social model of disability, that you will be successful. But building your collaborative networks could also be, and it's also mentioned, building your collaborative networks to be ready for the next one might be something you want to think about. So while it's not important for this one, I think you'll be successful regardless. It may well be important for the next one. And again, the data, and again, I think gathering the data might be almost the most important thing you could do in preparation of the 2019 round. Again, you're not going to need so much data for this one, but you might really want to think about, can you collect data, or do you need your project in this one to be about collecting? One of the activities in terms of strengthening your organisational capacity is collecting the data, which is simple as having enough time to give a staff member the job of sending out an email to everyone, setting up a database. They basically say they're not going to fund infrastructure, but one of the types of infrastructure that they're likely to fund, as long as it's not too big for your organisation, would be a database. You know, enabling you to set up MailChimp, enabling you to set up some other sort of database so that you can do communications with your members more regularly. And then question 12. So question 12 says, can I apply for the DPFO round if I am already, sorry, I'm just going to back off. I'm just going back to the things that you download. So the first thing that I was reading from was the grant guidelines. There's a separate thing on the community hub that's questions and answers. And questions and answers are things that organisations write into the particular website, email address, and then about once a week they do all the answers. So over the course of the 4 weeks of the grant round, that document changes. So it's worth going back onto that website and checking if there are extra questions and extra answers in case they're of interest to you. But the number of the question, so I'm answering question 12. So there was already a question in there that said, can I apply for the DPFO round if I'm already a grant recipient under either National Readiness Round 1 or 2 or Jurisdictional Based Round 1 or 2. So there are a number of organisations, including some organisations in the room, who are successful under the national grant rounds, and there have been a couple of Victorian organisations that have already been successful in the jurisdictional because they partnered with someone from another state. So I know that, so there was a project, for instance, I know because I was at Valid, where New South Wales CID and Valid went in together under the New South Wales round. So in fact, Valid is delivering a project that's actually from the New South Wales round. And the answer is, yes, you can apply if you are currently a recipient of another ILC grant. However, the current level of ILC funding and what it is being directed towards will be a consideration during assessment. So that is an answer that possibly needs to be interpreted. So I have to give you the caveat that what I'm about to say is an interpretation of that. It is not based on fact. However, it's also based on the fact that I myself and people that I work with closely are regular attendees at the NDIS CEO forum, and I've had a number of people read this, and we all read it the same way. Now, that's all I can say to you. I can't make any other promises. Our read of it is, if you've been successful and this round is oversubscribed, you will be discriminated against this time round. So our read of it is that this round is specifically for the, or not specific, they really, really want to fill the gap of people that have not been able to be successful. And if you've already been successful, you've probably already got the capacity to be successful, and I'm assuming you're Saru, almost. Are you? Oh, you're Saru. I was going to say, I know Saru's in the room, but I know Saru would be one that needs to really think about this. But the second part about it is in what it is being directed towards. So I would suggest to the organisations who have already been successful, apply for something really different that you can really differentiate. If you try and extend an existing ILC project, I think you're asking for trouble in this round. But that's my personal opinion. It's not based on, but my recommendation would be, don't extend a current project, do something different. And even though I know Sari's project is around peer support and other things, I'd still really make a point of difference.
So some of the funding that Saru and other organisations have gotten is ILC money, but through the state government, through DHHS, not through an ILC grant round. Do you know how that will tie into it?
No, that's a trickier proposition. And there's more than one organisation who's got DHHS sort of readiness, strengthening the advocacy sector type funding. I don't think that really impacts on it. I think the really critical bit is they really want to fund organisations that don't have capacity, and you want to just be careful that it doesn't look like you've already got that capacity. I think that's your critical thing. So, you've had some great projects and you should continue on doing the good work. But I've had this conversation already with 2 organisations who have been successful on how they're going to very specifically differentiate. And the way they're going to differentiate actually is that so far quite a lot of organisations have done work in developing resources and developing, like improving websites, developing resources, doing the other thing. This actually gives them an opportunity to go back and look at their people and go, how do we increase the meaningful involvement of people with disability in our organisation? What do we do about our governance? One organisation that I spoke to actually wants to do board training for families to help get them to understand why they don't always speak for people with disability. So well-meaning families maybe need to, and I'm guilty, need to shut the hell up and let the people with disabilities speak. So sometimes it's about, so I know one organisation, as well as giving individual capacity building for people with disability, also want to do some capacity building for the families, where the capacity building is actually shut up and listen. They might use more words in their 550 than those 4, but yeah, that's that. Yeah.
So in the application, we were funded through organisational capacity building through DHHS. That's coming to an end now.
Yes.
Would it be a good thing to sort of say we've had a successful capacity building project and we're looking to build individual capacity building with this grant to sort of build upon the work that we've already done? Or would it be not a good idea to mention?
I think you can build on the work,
yeah,
but you've really got to separate out that it's new. I think you've really got to demonstrate the new capacity building, that it's not it's got to be capacity building and not maintaining existing capacity, I suppose, is you want to differentiate there. Yep. Which is tricky, but sometimes it's just in the words that you use. So it's, so what I wanted to do, the 2 things that we were going to do in the last hour is make sure that the rest of the questions are answered, and then just spend a little bit of time on actual, maybe getting you to start jotting down your ideas and your answers to the 4 questions and just getting a bit of a feedback around the table. But I think given that we've answered a few questions already and it's 5 to 11, we probably should take that break. And then, we only just wanted just a quick break, 5-ish minutes, and we'll get back to the questions and the workshop then. I'm going to go through the questions now. The only thing I would say is there are some questions that relate to application strategy. So I'm not going to, I won't go through those in details because that'll be our last topic of conversation, will be the application strategy. But I will just go through, and to the people that would like the copies of the guidelines, could you put your hand up if you were one of the people that wanted the copies of the guidelines? Maeve's got them. Oh, you've got them? Anyone else? Excellent. Maeve's still got a copy there if you need them. So, clarification of the eligibility criteria for this specific grant. Hopefully we've gone through that already. The amount to ask for, again, would say the maximum as long as you're not so the only thing I would say is if you're a completely volunteer organisation with very low turnover, 118 actually might be too much. It might be safer to go for a smaller amount to get things going if you don't already have an established turnover. For organisations, I know quite a lot of the organisations in the room, I would imagine that you would go for the whole 118. Llewellyn's gone. Does anyone know where the...
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. No, I'm on... what I'm reading from is questions that VCOSS gave me. These are the things that you wrote down. So these questions are actually ones that the people in the room wrote before today.
You probably touched on it before, but could the outcome be derived by how much we put in for? As in, say, a regional advocacy service was to put in for 118 and the powers that be look at that and think, nah, too much?
This is, I think, related to the question that was asked before.
Yeah.
I think, and Martin, you can, again, chip in, but I think if you don't offer value, effectively, I think that's a bit about value for money. If you're not offering good value for money, I think you make yourself more vulnerable to being unsuccessful. But because of the it's a bit hard to tell. In the previous grants, you would have just been unsuccessful if it wasn't good value for money. Because this one's non-competitive, it's a bit unclear. They do certainly reserve the right to offer you less. But the way that the documents are written is it doesn't really say that we're going to talk individually to you about getting less. It's more if we're oversubscribed, then instead of the maximum being 118, we might just reduce it to 100, and that'll be for everyone.
Yep. Which
is a bit different to the value for money proposition. So you just want to make sure that what you're offering is value for money. If it's all right, I might just... Is that...
As I said before, you got two components, and I really can't see how you could do it for less than 118. If you're going to do your organisation capacity, individual capacity, and give value for money. If you sell yourself short, you won't provide value for money.
Yeah, and that's really true. The thing that I'm really getting at is there's a couple of there's people who are involved in volunteer organisations, and I think if you've been 100% volunteer, then going for the 118 in one go might not be a great idea. But I think it's just really, for most organisations, 118 is not going to be enough. So it's again what Martin said, don't overpromise. Don't try and do too much with that amount of money. Because the other thing is there'll be another project next year. I'm just going to keep I wasn't trying to shut down any questions. I'm just going to go through the questions that were already asked and then open to the floor, if that's all right. There was some questions about the fine print in the guidelines, which we will go through a little bit in the application strategy. Creative approaches, I'm not sure what that was asking for in terms of, yes, you'd like creative ideas, but really all you do is answer questions in an online form. So you're using words. There was another question about images. You're using words. They tell you in the grant application what attachments they want. They will not look at any other attachments you give them. They just will not. You only get the same, that's a thing about sort of probity and everyone level playing field. They've asked you for your annual report. They've asked you for your accounts. They've asked you for the budget. They don't want anything else. information on activities, funding priorities and timelines. Oh, the only other thing I was going to say was about the timeline. You'll notice that it says January, notification, anticipated April, negotiation award of grant agreements, anticipated May, activity commences May, June. End date is a year from, so what they've not done is given specific dates. So that's the downside, and that's because they're a bit nervous about how many applications will come in. And the other thing is, so far they've not managed to meet one single one of their own deadlines. And so now they're making them a bit far. The thing that I do know is that the amount of money for this grant round is from this current financial year. They need to get it out this financial year. So there's a very strong imperative that it all needs to be out the door by June. So I do think they will meet that deadline because that's a really strong imperative. But I wouldn't be holding my breath at the early end of those, on the 1st of April, for example. The other thing is, talk to each other, because once they start calling people and telling people they've been successful and unsuccessful, that all happens in a very short period. So if your sister organisations or other organisations are getting the calls, if you don't get a call in the next 48 hours, that's bad news. Your round came out by email. Oh, okay. Yeah, the national rounds came out. The organisations that were successful got phone calls and then an email, and the unsuccessful ones only got email. And the other thing they're doing in this grant round, which they haven't done before, is they have said that they will give individualised feedback. And usually they don't. They only give general feedback. I would absolutely apply for the individualised feedback, which I believe is also intended to increase organisational capacity by helping you with the individualised. I don't understand, if the majority of your members make up the disability component, will this disqualify or deter assessors from accepting our application? I think if you have a majority of members that have disability, that's a good thing. Does or can it offer, I've lost my, thank you. Does or can it cover service delivery if we build a case? I would say no. I can say have a go, but I would go back to the sorts of things they want to fund and do the things they want to fund. So it's the same thing, trying to wedge in something you already do is generally a bad idea. There's a question more about the extent, learning about what mainstream services are meeting the needs of people with disability and what levers can change these services, which is not really what this workshop's about, but I think really you're talking more about the big ILC and the different things that can happen in the outcomes of the whole ILC, not this grant round in particular, where you want to be concentrating on peer support. Greater understanding of ILC in the future, which we've tried to talk about, and writing an effective goal-based application, which we'll get into the application strategy. Identifying solutions for ensuring the continuity of the provision of information advocacy service for those organisations who don't meet the eligibility criteria. That's for this grant round. You will meet the criteria for the ongoing ILC. I think in Victoria, we're okay. The state government, Labor just won the state election. Advocacy funding is going to be okay for the next 4 years, at least the existing level of advocacy funding. Despite all the problems with advocacy, the NDAP program, there's a commitment to the NDAP program itself. There's a problem that they haven't increased any money, and there's a whole lot of other problems, but the NDAP program will continue. So when you talk about the ongoing solutions, it really comes to information linkages and capacity building. And I think I've explained about this round being a special round. So it will be different in the future if you don't meet the criteria. Can you just use the microphone? Yep.
I suppose the question was more beyond the rollout of NDIS, and I'm assuming at some point the grants or the opportunities to apply for grants will finish.
No. The ILC is an ongoing program.
So do you think that NDIA will be providing grants opportunities for perpetuate?
Yes, that's what the ILC is. That they're going to. But the thing that they will do increasingly. I was going to say that's exactly what I was going to say. They're going to start to do longer projects, which means the amount of funding per year available for one-off projects will slowly decline as they do. So it'll be 1 to 3 year projects, but it'll start to look a little bit like the state funding, where even though you get it in 1 year or 2 year blocks, it sort of is recurrent. As long as you do your job well, and as long as you keep, they're going to keep the focus on outcomes, but if you keep delivering, I think you can expect to keep being successful.
But it's not, will everyone be funded?
Oh, no.
Exactly,
No.
and that's my question. Where is the sustainability in that model if only selected organizations, for right reasons, will be funded, but there will be a pool of organizations that will not be funded for information, advocacy, capacity building? Because
no, we're not. Well, just reiterating that this funding round is not for advocacy.
Yes.
It will fund advocacy organisations, as Martin said, but not advocacy. So
I'm talking beyond this round. And
no. ILC will not fund our advocacy. So the whole advocacy argument about who funds advocacy is an argument to have with DSS,
but
not with the
NDIA.
Same
with information and capacity building.
Yeah,
not
but the information, yes, they will. Well, I mean, hopefully you would be, the thing that they're not going to do is go, oh, we're going to fund these disability groups and not others. So there is an intention that all the disability groups will be covered. So they're not going to go, oh, just because you're a tiny disability group, you won't be covered. But that's actually a much bigger question to be discussed with the agency as well. But the ILC is an ongoing program. So this is not just a 3 year. The problem is that they keep changing it. So they started with one thing, they changed it a bit, they've changed it already, they've done other grants with organisations. Now they're doing this one. Now there's going to be a new strategy. The problem is they've just kept moving the goalposts and we don't know where we stand.
And I suppose part of my question was also motivated by the information I received at one of the DHHS forums on ILC, where a comment was made from a person from NDIA that information provision will sit with LACs.
Say that again. The information
provision will sit with local agency, local area coordinators.
Sorry, with local area coordinators. Yes, but not they're never going to be the disability-specific organisations. They're never going to. The problem is local information. And the other thing that we haven't seen yet, in terms of the NDIS operating as it's designed, it's still not operating as it's designed because the LACs are supposed to do local information, community development, all these things, and all we've been worrying about is transition. They've only had enough staff, and this is, some of this is caused by the agency themselves and some of it's caused by bilateral agreements and external factors. They haven't had enough resources to do much more than get everyone in. So we haven't seen what the benefits of LACs actually being LACs might be once we get through the transition. So the next couple of years will be very interesting because we'll, June next year in Victoria, we should finish the transition and then it's okay, now what it's going to look like, and the actual roles of the LACs will mature and we'll see what happens. That's my very optimistic answer. Local area coordinators. So when people come into the scheme, at the moment, the local area coordinator for the majority of us is who actually has the plan. We have the planning meeting. So LACs have been doing planning meetings and plans and getting everything going. But if, every Australian Council has been, roaming around the country doing these forums, every single one, people come in, why can't we get multi-year plans? Why can't we do these other things? So as these other efficiencies, the agency is clearly looking for people who are in stable things and not in a life transition, might get a 2-year plan or a 3-year plan. That'll reduce the demand on LACs, so there's a whole maturing. We knew that the transition was going to be a time of turmoil. That's proven to be true. And now we have to go into the post-transition and see what happens. I believe that we've covered those. Again, there was a question about identifying opportunities for collective lobbying of the scheme, so organisations that don't meet the DPFO mark. Just wanted to say that we don't expect that the future rounds will only be available to DPFOs. What they're trying to do is increase the capacity of the DPFOs to participate in the competitive grant rounds. So I wouldn't be worried, even if you don't meet the criteria now, I don't think it's going to be a problem. You will meet the criteria for ongoing. and I would still talk to Dana, because I think Dana, Disability Advocacy Network of Australia, I think that's your peak body who is doing that lobbying for advocacy agencies to, you know, be sustainable. Yes, a person asked about imagery and graphics, or is written content enough? In this case, the written content is enough. And I think that's all the questions. So I think we can open up to the floor now. Yes.
So just could we explore that issue a little bit more about the is it DFPO?
DPFO. So DPO is the UN name, Disabled People's Organisations, and they've added this families in.
Yep. Yeah. Because VCOSS is offering support around making organisations more user-led. So how much of a push do we think it will be? How much do we think that the ILC funding in the future will be directed towards those organisations?
I think this is one of the aims of the ILC, is to have people with disability directing much more of what happens with funding. So that's why I've talked about increasing the meaningful involvement of people with disability in your governance. I don't think they're going to do what they've done this time and said that they're the only people that can apply. But in terms of maximising your chances of success, the more the ILC the organisations that have already been successful in ILC have said one of the reasons for their success is they had high degree of meaningful governance of the project and of the organisation of people with disabilities. So certainly that is building that would be a long-term success strategy in ILC.
The guidelines do say that applications requesting more than 118 will be considered. Do you have any idea of what the additional value for money kind of proposition would need to be around that? Is there a risk that DSS will just kick those out if you ask for more?
Oh, I don't think you'll get kicked out as long as you meet all the other things. I don't think you'll get kicked out at the initial level. What happens later on is a different thing. I would think that if you're going to, you'd have to have a very good reason to ask for more. I think one of the ways of asking for more is collaboration. If it was a group of organisations going for things, and you said, this is a value for money proposition that 3 organisations where we would all go for the 118 separately, we can actually do much more with $300,000 together than what we'd be able to do with 118 each separately. I think that would give it a possibility. I think anything else is optimistic.
Good to know.
But I don't think they'll knock you out.
Yeah,
but
that's what I was worried about.
Catherine, what did you mean exactly about the purpose of this round is to get you ready for next round? Sort of like, have I got it that this round will be for 12 months?
Yep.
And then...
Although the next round will come out in March or something next year, before you've even got this funding. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit what you mean exactly by that?
Yes. So what the agency has found is that the organisations that have been successful in the ILC round so far is the sorts of organisations they want to see successful, which are grassroots, user-led organisations, very like the ones in this room, have not been successful so far. And what they're trying to do is give you a special grant round that says, this is your opportunity to get yourselves up to speed like the other organisations. And that means, it might mean having more people with disability active in your organisation, but it means for the organisations that are already good at that bit, that maybe they actually need to increase their grant writing expertise or their ability to design the sorts of programs that the ILC wants to see. So one organisation I regard very highly always talks about the fact there's bad information in their disability area for parents, and that parents don't understand the implications of decisions that they make for their young person with disability.
That'd be us.
Yeah, And what they put in for was effectively like a heart tick program. So you know how the Heart Foundation goes tick, tick, tick. They wanted to go into mainstream organisations and go, oh, are you really welcoming to our disability group? It was never going to get up. So the thing that I found frustrating is they absolutely were led by people with disability. They absolutely met every criteria, but they still wanted to go for this really big left field sort of project instead of going, this thing you complain about all the time about information for families, why don't you just write information for families? It's a gap. So it's too tight. You know, I think there's organisations that do some stuff well, but maybe particularly family-led organisations maybe don't let the voice of people with disabilities come through enough. And I think that's one area of capacity building is really important. I think for organisations that are really good at disability-led, sometimes it's an increase. Often organisations that are led by people with disability, by nature of who they are and of the barriers faced by people with disability, they have a little bit less corporate experience. They have other. So what I would use as an example, there's a organisation, there's a woman with disability who has led organisations, currently is a leader, who's just fantastic. She's so good. She's well educated. She's experienced a lot of barriers, but she's really up there. When the first ILC policy came out, I sat with her in a meeting and I said, well, it's perfectly clear that the agency wants this, this and this. And she went, stop right there. She said to me, it's not clear to me at all. How can you say that's clear? And the reason was I am more experienced at reading government documents than she is. And so so this is the thing that I'm doing where I read the answer to number 12. It's like when you've got experience and you read that answer, you understand what they're trying to say. And that's the problem. Like, I can't promise that I've got it right. But if you've read these documents for a long, long time, you've got an idea what they're saying. Because they use weasel words. They don't use plain language. They don't do it that way. And what became apparent to me was I read it and understood it because I had that experience. And she didn't because she'd worked in the disability sector pretty much all of her career, whereas I worked in the corporate sector as well. And it was like, and that was a light bulb moment for me to go, and learnings for the agency, because they keep writing things in friggin', government language, that's not apparent. And so part of the reason I'm running a workshop like this is to try to do the translation. So capacity building, there's not one size fits all answer, but it is, so the getting ready means and that's where you have to do your thinking and go, how are we not ready? Is because we're not very good at grant writing or we haven't been successful? Because we don't know how to read? Do we need someone to help us read all the documents and understand what these government words mean? Is it because we don't have enough people with disability? And there's a whole range of things, but that range of things are all described on that page 19. Most of the things I'm talking about meet one of those dot points. I think the lady in the striped top had her hand up first.
Yeah, I just wanted to add internally how we got our ILC grant, the national one, but because I'm the head of fundraising, so my job is bring in the dollars. So when it comes to government speak, though, no idea, but our programs and services manager, she's, this is her bread and butter. She reads it. So I wrote the grant and then she went in and put all the weasel words in, And I think, if you've got that kind of balance in your organisation where, 2 or 3 people with different skills can have a look at it, I think that helps you be more successful.
And that would be so a lot of organisations here don't have that. And my recommendation is that's why you need to talk to each other. And that's why the last half hour that we want to do here is a bit of talking to each other and testing ideas with each other. And then using a VCOSS or using me or using whatever to go, people have come up to me in the break going, do you think these things will meet the criteria? And it's like, and the answer has been it's like, yes, I do think some of them will. And no, I don't think some of them will. And that's the problem I've had so far with the disability-led organisations is sometimes because they've got a really good idea, they don't want to take the advice as they probably won't get up for other reasons. And sometimes it's like, take the advice. Even though I don't have a disability, maybe you want to take some advice. And so that's been a bit challenging for me along the way.
2 questions, Catherine, if I can. One is about if you put up an initiative that's about the capacity building, but it's actually utilising existing initiatives or projects like the Voice at the Table through SARU or some other initiative, will that be looked at favourably? I'm assuming they don't want to see a whole lot of organisations, again, trying to duplicate how you might undertake a capacity building for governance or for individuals.
But again, I don't know quite enough about Voice at the Table, but it might be that by participating in Voice at the Table, you identified a need and a gap in your own organisation that you now need this funding to fill. Or or the Voice at the Table didn't give you enough resources to, it made you aware of something you needed to do, but you didn't have the resources. So it's just, you do have to show the additional need. I don't know whether I'm making that clear, but it's somehow yes, you want to build, it's very good to build on existing things, but you've got to show that there's a new need.
I understand.
Yeah.
While I've got this, can I ask one more question? And that is about, we've talked about governance and having, a representation of people with disability. If the folk that you're servicing are primarily people with intellectual disability, and we certainly work really hard to engage people with intellectual disability in that kind of decision-making arena. How would it be viewed if you broadened your representation, if you like, amongst your governance with a broader sample of people with disability?
I think the increased engagement of people with disability is a good thing regardless. I think this is why the families have been involved too, but I know when you talk about individual advocacy, often it's the Down syndrome associations of the world that have the functional families and the families with capacity, and I feel like individual advocacy is the other side of the same coin, because they're the people it's people with the same disability, but it's the individual advocacy agencies that actually pick up the people with no networks or dysfunctional families or whatever. So it's still an extension of, that's why I think you need both types of organisations to get the whole story. But that's why with intellectual disability, it's the greater push to, there are ways of having people with intellectual disability be more involved in your governance. There are ways, it does take time. And I think the agency is sympathetic. That's why I don't overpromise, and that's where the Voice at the Table stuff, it's like you've got this far, now you want to do this next step, this step. So that building is fine, but you've just got to say that gap is all, you've got to just say that's still a gap. The Voice at the Table didn't fill, like it got us to there, and now we're going to build on it with the new need and the new gap.
So just as far as individual capacity building again, is providing career opportunities for people with a disability part of that? So creating jobs for people with a disability to participate in our organisation?
I'm not sure. You've asked, a couple of people have asked around employment. I think what I would say in this round is this round's not looking, the guidelines, for instance, aren't saying how many people with disability are going to end up in employment. But it is interested in developing your capacity to have a mechanism. So one of the questions I was asked again about people maybe living independently or people moving in, it's the establishment of the peer support network, the establishment of the process that will build, actually you're not looking for capacity building of your organisation, you're looking for individual. It does talk about boards, staff and volunteers. It mentions all three, so there is an argument about staff, but again I'm worried that that's I don't know, I'm not sure about where that fits in whether they view that as organisational capacity building or individual.
Surely creating career paths and developing people's careers is individual capacity building.
It is. I just think it's not quite the purpose of this grant round. Like, I think it's absolutely one of the aims of the scheme, and it's absolutely, any of us in this environment are very, very keen to see the employment, there's a whole lot of us that think employment first, that when people go in for the NDIS plans, the first thing that they should be talking about is your pathway to employment. So this is not criticising that, because I think but I think this is where you've got to really make sure that your idea and the guidelines match. And I'm not prepared to say no, it's bad, because it's a great idea, but it's hard to tell.
And also, you mentioned local area coordinators. We're already providing information and referrals to them.
Yes.
They're coming to us saying we're sort of unfamiliar with how to navigate the.
Are you getting any funding for that?
No.
No. So maybe you're not doing that. Maybe that's a gap of unmet need that you need to get funded for.
Put that in here. Yeah, but again, we're only capable of applying for individual capacity building. Wouldn't that qualify for organisational capacity?
That would be, yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah. He's asking if the sorts of things that the discussion that we've just had is still very much oriented towards organisational capacity building, and not but because the organisation that this gentleman represents is a cohort, they're not allowed to apply for organisational capacity funding, only individual. So that would get back to, then you'd still be wanting to run workshops for people that increase their capacity to do that. Yeah.
So it could be peer-led, peer
Yes.
support groups.
Yes. Great. Yeah. That would give you a mechanism. Yeah, then that would give you a mechanism for individual capacity building. There's a few hands up. Sorry, while I was trying to unpick that.
Sorry, me again. I'm interested. We have a very strong volunteer citizen advocacy program. If there was an emphasis on the recruitment, retention and broadening of the citizen advocates, more inclusive of people with disability?
Yes, but again, be careful that you don't overlap into something that they think should be funded within advocacy. Still needs to look like community development or information delivery, and not. So I wouldn't be using the word citizen advocacy in your application. I would be talking about community development and the use of volunteers, like all the same things that you do, but I would not use, as soon as you say citizen advocacy, they're going to go, that's not this program. But talk about mentors and talk. Yes.
Duplication.
Yeah, but Choice Mentors, the Valid Choice Mentors was funded out of ILC. Use your words. All right, I'm running myself short of time, so if we're going to do this short bit of work on application strategy. So the thing is, there's a thing about decision theory that says it doesn't really matter who you talk to about making a decision. You improve your decision making just by sharing. Really, really encourage you to either find capacity within your organisation and have more than one person involved in it, because people would build different strengths, or find yourself a local group or of like organisations and work together with your suggestions. It really, and get some, if you can get anyone else to read your application before it's completely done. Now, in terms of the other things that I would just say, can't find my own piece of paper. I just did want to say, so have a narrative. Tell a bit of a story. Tell the story of need. Don't spend all your words admiring the problem. There's a problem, this is a solution. So, I've done many, many applications. Using the words, this is the problem, this is the solution. You can say it as plain as you like. I would write down, don't do your first draft to the words. Your first draft has got to be explain what it is you're trying to do. Write it all down so you've got it clear in your head. Then worry about which bits can answer, which bits go into which answers, and then worry about the edit back to the words. So start with a good explanation before you worry about the number of words. The budget and the plan need to match. So I've had a couple where people have written a proposal, and then when I've read the budget says that they're going to run, there was one that I read that said they were going to run 2 consultations. Nowhere in the description of what they were going to do were these 2 consultations mentioned, but they were in the budget. So I was like, I think you need to talk about that over here. It was fine, but it didn't match. So you've got to make sure that the story told by your budget and the story told by your words match each other and link to each other and, add value to each other. And I was just going to mention again back to those. Then we're going to look at section 7. So 7 is the selection criteria. So these are the bits where you might, if you just wanted to take a few minutes, it's describe criterion 1, building organisational capacity. Describe the specific activities you intend to do to build organisational capacity. In your response, you should describe the activities and explain why they are needed. That's your evidence of need. So what you're going to do and why they are needed. Then you're going to do the same thing in criterion 2 about building individual capacity and opportunity for people with disability, families and carers. Then criterion 3, you're going to talk about the results. Now you've got 4 criterion, don't duplicate, don't re-say things. So describe what you're going to do in criterion 1 and 2. Then in criterion 3, talk about your results. What do you expect to happen? What are the outcomes? What are the outputs? How are you going to evaluate it? Are you going to survey people? How are you going to find out what benefit you were? And then you're going to talk about organisation capability. And the organisation capability includes your project management, how you're going to manage it, who's going to do it, what are the key milestones, how you plan to engage people with disability in the planning and delivery of the project, including employment. So my read of that is actually the purpose of, I don't think the purpose of the funding is to get someone a job, but the purpose of the funding is to deliver a project where we intend to give someone a job. So there's a different nuance in the way you do it. If the outcome is just the person with a job, that's not the outcome of this. But if the outcome is to deliver a project in the course of delivering the project, we're going to employ a person with disability, then you're on the money. And so I am not giving, I hoped to have given a bit more time to this, but really number 1 and 2, Martin's keen on number 3, Martin's keen on project logic and outcomes and outputs. We hoped we might be able to mention that at some point, but I think that's maybe a separate workshop. But thinking about, I don't know what you want to do, whether you'd like to just take 5 or 10 minutes in your little groups and brainstorm ideas, or whether you've already got ideas that you'd like to test with each other. Does anyone have a preference? I think we have to keep it fairly short, but if we talk for just 6 or 7 minutes between yourselves and have a bit of a chat about the sorts of ideas and get some feedback from the people with you about whether or not you think they're good ideas. The upside here is this is a non-competitive round. Oh, hang on, I'll just take this off. Okay. That was a whole 7 minutes. So if I could call you back. It is. As soon as you let this sector start talking to each other, that's it. So if I could call you back. I'm very sorry that it wasn't very long enough. I know. Once you get into the ideas, that's it. So we're into the last 5 minutes. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have enough time. What I was hoping to do was actually do a little bit of cross-pollination of ideas and talk more generally in the group about what are the ideas and what do we think. So I apologise that we didn't quite get to that. So the last thing I just wanted to check is, out of those discussions, did any new questions come up? Yes, microphone's coming.
The question on my mind is, you were saying about organisations that are funded DHS, and you reckon that organisations that would have, say, core funding from them for their activities, that would be safe. So this is not going to, at this stage anyway, replace that immediately.
No, that wasn't quite what I meant.
Building on what
sort of, so if you, it depends where you get your, what your DHS or DHHS money is. If you get funded under an information, like if you're funded as an information provider, you are going to lose your funding in June next year. And so you are going to want this funding to replace that. But replace is you can't just get your DHHS contract and go, now I'm going to have the same contract with the NDIS. You've been providing information.
Got to build in these features, is that what
you got it? Yeah, but this round is about getting ready for that. So this is more about peer support, but it could be, in terms of building organisational capacity, it could be making sure you've got a website that's more easily updatable, or it might be employing a person to transfer information. I don't know, it could be a variety of things. You're not automatically going to get the money. So even though the state has funded you as an information provider, there's no guarantee that the NDIA are going to fund you as an information provider, except to say that the NDIAs are not interested in letting organisations die. They want organisations to continue. But where the problem is, as long as you're not duplicating someone else's, you're not doing something that someone else is doing as well. And they're very interested in national, even for rare conditions, they're interested in national networks. They're not very interested in state-based networks all doing the same thing. So this is where I really encourage you to develop networks. Not sure if that answers your question.
Getting there.
Because Cystic Fibrosis Community Care, we merged with New South Wales last year. So is it okay to say the funding will be spent in Victoria and New South Wales, just, even though we're only putting the application in for Victoria?
Yeah, but yes to both. So this round is a national round, but even in the jurisdictional round, so what I was saying is that in the jurisdictional round, so in the New South Wales jurisdictional round, I know of Victorian organisations who were part of collaborations who were successful. So yes, the money can be spent in more than one state, but you've got to demonstrate your outcomes, demonstrate that you're meeting the guidelines, all the rest of it. Yeah, but yes, that's fine.
Cool. So a lot of my organisation's activities are co-designed. Could we build into the budget sort of ways to remunerate people for their time and expertise in co-designing our projects?
I would think so. One of the things that we all want to see together with that the agency wants to see and we all want to see is that everyone's paid for their time and paid for their expertise. And certainly in the last couple of years, very strong expectations that you would pay every person with disability who acts in an advisory capacity. And absolutely that would be part of your project.
What kind of amount would you suggest would be reasonable?
Are you talking about an hourly rate, or are you talking about?
So yeah, we would sort of say, I'm talking overall budget. What would you put into the actual budget?
That's too broad, because you need to know what the idea is, because some ideas are more labour intensive than others. What I would say is in the ones that I do, and it depends, if you're only going to use a person with disability for a really short period of time, we would usually give them gift vouchers of some description at about $50 an hour. Would be around. Are you doing $50 an hour at Saru when you do? It depends on what. If you're paying someone directly, then you'd pay them a award, but then they get. So if you're using them for longer, then you might take them on as a part-time staff member, and then it's the award, but then there's super, and then there's other things. So, and there's also the implication for the DSP. If people are on the disability support pension, sometimes it's very difficult for them just to be paid $400 in one fortnight as a random event.
What if we were to give them on cash honorariums, and if they can negotiate it on their own terms?
Well, then you've got.
Okay,
so there's a whole thing is remembering
their money.
Yeah, but remembering that you're meeting these guidelines, but at the same time you have to meet the governance regime in terms of the Australian Tax Office and other things. You can't, honorariums. So I volunteer at the local basketball club, and so honorariums they're never anywhere close to the actual amount of work. So the honorarium that the president gets really is a thing to make sure that he's not out of pocket for his internet and his phone. So he gets $400 a year or something, but he would spend hours and hours. So honorariums aren't really intended to pay people for the value of their work. Once you start paying people for the value of their work, you get into trouble with the tax office. So you've got to pay. So therefore, we've worked around it with gift cards, but it's tricky. So you just got to remember your whole governance has got to work. It's not just this project in isolation. You've got to do it in the rules of the tax office at the same time.
As an organisation or as individuals?
As an organisation. But you can capacity build. There are ways around it, but cash in general is a really bad idea, because is generally a bad idea. I would never. My husband's a builder. We don't deal in cash. It's a bad idea there. That's tax evasion. The reason for cash most of the time is tax evasion. So therefore, you've got to be really careful when you move into cash, which is why other things, which are gifts, honorarium is okay. But if someone's worked 8 hours and you're going to give them a $400 honorarium, it's not really an honorarium. It's actually payment for service. See, but that's a tax office rule, but if you read these things, somewhere in there it says you've got to meet all the other rules of the Commonwealth at the same time.
So let's say we had LGBTI people with disability looking over our documents, like volunteers' documents, to identify barriers to access and inclusion. They could do a document review, and they will sort of let us know, this would be a barrier for me, this would be a barrier for me, and we go, okay, thank you.
So it depends whether
of your work here is $50. Thank you.
Yeah. So that would be a consultation. So that would be more of a consultation type of thing, where you would give people vouchers. If you're employing them to do it as an expert, then you would pay them for their hours in a way that is acceptable to the tax office. And yes, that can be built into the project budget, absolutely. But you can't just give you can't, but it's not a great idea just to give someone $50 cash, because then you're not paying you're paying them for services. You're paying them. That's what we do when we employ people. We pay people for their time. There's supposed to be tax taken out of that. They're supposed to be super paid on that, what have you. So you get into real problems when you get into cash. Cash is messy, full stop. Yes. As you can see, I would. And it's hard enough. It's hard enough buying. I don't know, I went to Woolies one day on a Dana project and bought $800 vouchers. And first of all, they made sure that I wasn't being ripped off by some scam, because apparently that's what the scammers do now, is send you off. And secondly, it's a lot of money. $800 is a lot of money to hand over even then, and you've got to look at your governance and make sure that's only a very small part of the project. If that was the biggest part of money going out of the project, they'd really not like it. But if you're spending $118,000 doing other things and $400 is going out, then that's okay. So there's some, that's other governance. That's not this, but that you still have to have your other governance right. I don't think I explained that very well.
Okay, another example, we paid a local elder to do a welcome to country, paid her $150. Our auditor picked that up and said, and they give you an ABN, or you would put their tax phone number and you would hold their tax. You can't do that. So that is another example of where Aboriginal want to be, and they should be paid for the work they do, but it's got to be within the appropriate guidelines. So I'm just using that as an example of how, unless you got a tax phone number or an ABN, you don't pay.
That's right. You pay on invoice. You either pay an employee or you pay on invoice. But it's now kicked over from 12 o'clock. I think we need to wrap up. I hope that was helpful. Please do give Maeve all the feedback. Any feedback to me is most welcome. And I forgot to put, I managed to not put a slide up with my contact details, but I've got cards here if you want to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for coming. And